Everyone knows the story of the Titanic. How the largest moving object sank in the middle of the North Atlantic.
Everyone knows the Titanic's tragic tale, but few realize she had two sister ships, and all three shared a strange, unlucky fate. One even rushed to rescue the Titanic that fateful night, only to arrive too late. These ocean giants were more than ships. They were engineering marvels with stories of grandeur, ambition, and eerie misfortune. From near misses to fatal flaws, something always seemed to go wrong. So what really doomed the Titanic trio? One thing is clear: the Titanic's sister ship had a secret, and it explains everything. An idea takes root. It all started with a quiet conversation in the summer of 1907. It was a sit-down between two of the most powerful men in the shipping world. On one side of the table sat J. Bruce Ismay, the ambitious chairman of the White Star Line. Opposite him was none other than the American financial titan J. Pierpont Morgan. And they weren't just chatting about ordinary cargo ships or passenger ferries. Their minds were locked on a bigger, bolder idea. This idea involved vessels so massive, so luxurious, that the world would have no choice but to stop and stare. The stakes were high, because White Star's biggest rival, Cunard, had already unveiled Lusitania and Mauretania, which were speed demons that ruled the Atlantic. German lines were also closing in, but instead of trying to outpace everyone, Ismay decided to outclass them. And so, the vision of the Olympic-class liners was born. These were three ships, bigger than anything the oceans had ever seen: the Olympic, the Titanic, and later, the Britannic. The Olympic was the very first of her kind, but her journey is more complicated than you think. The birth of the Olympic. The Olympic story begins in Belfast, Ireland, where Harland and Wolff, White Star's go-to shipbuilders since the 1860s, were handed the dream. Cost was barely a concern. The firm was told to spend what it needed and tack on a 5% profit. They were handed a blank check, essentially, to build the most impressive vessels of their time. Lord Peary oversaw the operation, and Thomas Andrews, the shipyard's managing director, took the reins on design. Edward Wilding handled all the complicated math behind stability and trim, while Alexander Carlisle focused on the finer details including decoration, lifeboats, and the feel of the ship itself. Together, they shaped a behemoth that would change ocean travel forever. By July of 1908, plans were on the table. Ismay gave the nod, and construction was a go. At first, the Olympic wasn't even called the Olympic. She was just number 400, the 400th hull ever built by Harland and Wolff. The Titanic, her soon-to-be famous sister, followed closely as 401. The Olympic's keel was laid in December of 1908, and by October 20, 1910, she was ready to meet the water. But in typical White Star fashion, there was no champagne smash and no christening, because the line never believed in such rituals. Instead, her hull, painted a soft gray for the cameras, slid into the river under the eyes of film crews and photographers. The Titanic was still rising beside her, only half-formed. Plus, the Olympic's inner workings were just as impressive as her gleaming shell. She boasted 3 propellers, 2 side blades driven by massive triple-expansion engines, and a central one powered by a turbine that recycled the steam those engines spit out. It was a clever system tested on the earlier SS Laurentic, and it worked. On her maiden voyage, the Olympic averaged almost 22 knots while burning 650 tons of coal a day. By comparison, Cunard's speedsters needed over 1,000 tons to reach similar speeds. The Olympic was efficient, and there was no denying just how impressive the ship had turned out to be. Even when it came to luxury, the Olympic didn't hold back. First-class passengers walked into a dream with lavish staterooms, some with private baths, and a grand staircase that looked like it belonged in a palace. There was also a dining saloon that could seat hundreds, an a la carte restaurant for more intimate meals, and that was just the start. There was a Georgian smoking room, a cafe with palm trees, a full Turkish bath, a swimming pool, and even a gym. Plus, the second class didn't exactly suffer either. Smoky lounges, a library, and a lift were all part of the deal. And here's the best part. Third class didn't have to fit into the cramped dorms of older ships anymore. The Olympic offered private cabins with 2 to 10 bunks, common areas, and a clean dining room. For many immigrants, this was the most comfort they had ever known. One visual hallmark set the Olympic apart: the fourth funnel. Unlike most ships, which used all their funnels for ventilation and smoke, the Olympic's fourth funnel was a dummy, added purely for looks, and to help ventilate the kitchens below. It gave the ship symmetry and made passengers feel they were sailing aboard a titan of the sea. But how different was the Olympic from the Titanic? Here's where things get juicy. The differences between the Olympic and the Titanic. The Titanic, as glamorous as she was basically the Olympic's younger twin with a few upgrades. Based on feedback from the Olympic's first year, the Titanic's designers made some key tweaks. Her A-deck promenade was enclosed at the front, giving guests shelter from harsh Atlantic winds. This also bumped up the Titanic's tonnage, making her technically the largest ship in the world. And there were many other adjustments coming along. The Olympic had a barely used first-class promenade on B-deck, so the Titanic ditched it. Instead, she added bigger staterooms with en-suite baths, a café parisien, and an expanded restaurant. These upgrades came at a cost, and the Titanic's second-class promenade had to be reduced to make room. More differences popped up inside. The Titanic had wider use of Axminster carpeting, plusher than the linoleum used aboard the Olympic. Her B-deck aft staircase had a reception room the Olympic lacked. Plus, there were more gangway entrances, more private promenades, and in general, a slightly more refined feel. There's one eerie moment in their timeline that deserves mention. March 2nd, 1912, the Olympic limped into dry dock after throwing a propeller blade. To her side was the Titanic, fresh-faced and nearly ready for her maiden voyage. It was the last time the two ships would ever be seen together. In photos taken that day, the Olympic looks weathered, a ship with stories. The Titanic, by contrast, is poised, untested, unknowingly weeks away from disaster. The Olympic would go on to serve for decades through wars, peace, and endless crossings, earning the nickname Old Reliable. But underneath that nickname lies a forgotten truth. She was always the prototype, the first of her kind, the one that taught the world how big, how luxurious, and how tragic ocean travel could become, and maybe the one that held more secrets than she ever let on. The Olympic switch theory. So, what if the Titanic wasn't the Titanic? Sounds ridiculous at first, but this might be the one secret that the Olympic had been silently keeping all along. Because according to one of the most infamous maritime conspiracy theories ever spun, the ship that sank on that icy night in April of 1912 might not have been the Titanic at all. Imagine two nearly identical luxury liners, the Titanic and her older sister ship, the Olympic. Now, imagine one of them, the Olympic, suffers a nasty collision with a British naval cruiser in 1911, just months before Titanic's maiden voyage. The damage is bad enough to leave White Star Line bleeding money, caught in lawsuits, and facing a massive repair bill with no insurance payout. And that's when, according to the theory, something bold and sinister was set in motion. This story, popularized by Robin Gardner, suggests that White Star Line, possibly with a little nudge from powerful financier J.P. Morgan, pulled off a shocking switch. They allegedly disguised the wounded Olympic as Titanic, swapped the nameplates, made a few cosmetic tweaks, and sent her out to sea under a new identity. Why? Because if she sank, they could collect insurance money on what was now technically Titanic, brand new, fully insured, and worth far more than the Olympic. And sure enough, that ship sank. Now, the hook here isn't just the swap. It's the questions that still swirl around it. Supporters of this theory have pointed out some puzzling details, including minor differences in window placements, floor plans, and internal fittings that, they claim, don't quite match Titanic's blueprints. Some even say survivors noticed odd things, like older parts aboard what was supposed to be a brand new vessel. But here's where the mystery meets hard evidence. Decades later, deep-sea explorations brought back photos and fragments from the wreck. Experts pored over the data, comparing serial numbers, materials, and layout against shipyard records. Their conclusion was that the ship on the ocean floor really is Titanic. Still, the theory refuses to die. And then there's J.P. Morgan, the biggest plot twist of this story. He funded the White Star Line and had a ticket for Titanic's maiden voyage. But at the last minute, he didn't board. Some claim he backed out because he knew what was coming. Others say his absence was just a coincidence. But when you're dealing with disasters this huge, people rarely believe in coincidences. The fall of the Titanic. On April 14, 1912, as the Titanic was tearing through the Atlantic, the Olympic was making her way back from New York. At around midnight, Ernest James Moore, the Olympic's wireless operator, caught a desperate signal, and it became clear that the Titanic was in serious trouble. She was 505 miles away, but the Olympic's captain, Herbert James Haddock, didn't hesitate. He gave the order to turn the ship, set the engines to full power, and make for the Titanic. But time was not on their side. As the Olympic steamed forward, slicing through the waves, another message crackled through the wireless. It was from Captain Rostron of the RMS Carpathia. According to him, the Titanic had already gone under at around 2:20 in the morning. Only 675 people had been saved, and everyone else was gone. The Olympic offered to take on the survivors, but Rostron was following orders from J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star chairman who had barely survived the sinking himself. So, he refused. He feared that stepping aboard a near-identical ship to the Titanic would traumatize the survivors even further, so the Olympic turned back toward Southampton. Now, the Olympic had a new role to play. She became the model for both American and British investigations. Her equipment, identical to the Titanic's, was examined thoroughly, including lifeboats, bulkheads, and doors. Even sea trials were reenacted to determine how long it would have taken the Titanic to steer clear of that fatal iceberg. But just as the Olympic began to process her place in the Titanic's shadow, she faced unrest from within. The upgrades that followed. By late April 1912, a new concern took hold. The Olympic, like her doomed sister, had never been fitted with enough lifeboats for every passenger. After the disaster, second-hand collapsible boats were scrambled from troop ships and loaded onto the Olympic in haste. But these collapsibles? They were old, rotten. Some wouldn't even open properly. When the crew saw this, they refused to sail. 284 firemen went on strike, fearing the lifeboats wouldn't hold if disaster struck. In response, White Star scrambled to hire non-union replacements from Southampton and Liverpool. But many of these replacements had never worked on a ship of the Olympic size, and the regular crew was furious. A group of 54 sailors walked off in protest, declaring the non-union crew unsafe. The strike spiraled, and the Olympic's voyage was cancelled. The 54 sailors were arrested for mutiny and dragged into court in Portsmouth on May 4th, but in a twist of public sympathy, the court found them guilty, yet let them go without fine or jail time, citing the special circumstances. Eventually, the Olympic got her makeover in 1913. They gave the Olympic a massive safety refit with extra lifeboats, an inner watertight skin along half the hull, and 17 watertight compartments instead of the original 16. 5 of those bulkheads were raised all the way to B-deck, and she didn't just get safer, she got fancier too. The Olympic adopted many of the Titanic's upgrades. Enlarged suites, the Café Parisien, and the expanded restaurant all found a home aboard the Olympic. It was as if the ship was reborn, learning from her sister's fate and rising again, this time stronger, sleeker, and smarter. Still, there was a lot left for the Olympic to go through. The war and what came after. When war broke out in August of 1914, the Olympic was thrust into a world she was never built for. At first, she kept up civilian runs in ghostly silence, with her hull painted gray, portholes blacked out, and lights dimmed. But by October, with U-boat threats rising and passengers fleeing, she was pulled from service. Then came a dramatic moment, rescuing the crew of the sinking HMS Audacious before being detained in secrecy. Later transformed into a troopship, the Olympic carried thousands to battle, even slicing a German U-boat in half with her propeller in a rare act of wartime aggression. She eventually earned the nickname Old Reliable. Then, in the summer of 1919, the war was finally over, but the Olympic was worn, weary, and no longer the sleek marvel that had launched an era. After years of serving as a troop carrier, she limped back to Belfast, no longer draped in military gray, but in need of a serious makeover. What she returned for was rebirth. And that's exactly what happened. Inside the shipyards of Harland and Wolff, engineers stripped her down and began something close to a resurrection. Gone was the sooty coal-burning engine system, and in came a modern oil-firing setup that slashed refueling time from days to mere hours. In just 5 or 6 hours, she'd be ready to sail again. Once the ship emerged from repairs, she came out stronger, bigger, and more glamorous than ever. On June 25, 1920, the Olympic returned to the ocean, her sails full of new promise. On just one voyage that year, she carried over 2,000 passengers, and by year's end, more than 28,000 had sailed aboard her. 1921 would bring an even greater record, with 38,000 passengers in a single year, which was her golden peak. But despite her success, something was missing. Her sister ships, the Titanic and the Britannic, had been lost to the sea. The Olympic now sailed alone, but that changed in 1922 when White Star acquired 2 former German liners, Majestic and Homeric, handed over as part of the post-war reparations. Together, the trio ruled the waves again until the tides of history began to shift once more. For many, the Olympic's appeal was personal. She was the Titanic's twin. Those who never made it aboard the Titanic sought her mirror image, a chance to experience what might have been without the tragedy. But not every moment was cinematic. The downfall of the Olympic. In March of 1924, the Olympic found herself in another collision, this time in New York Harbor. As she backed away from her berth, a smaller ship, the Fort St. George, slipped into her path. The impact left the smaller vessel badly damaged, and though the Olympic appeared to have gotten away with a scratch, the truth emerged later. Her stern post was fractured. An entirely new stern frame was required, which was another costly reminder of her size and momentum. Then, in June, Lord Peary, one of the men who had helped bring the Olympic to life, died suddenly aboard a ship off Cuba. When his body arrived in New York, the Olympic was chosen to carry him home. Flags were lowered, engines were quiet, and she became a floating memorial to the man who helped build her. But as the 20s waned, trouble crept in again, this time from the shores of America. new immigration laws cut down the flow of hopeful newcomers to just 160,000 a year. With fewer immigrants, the transatlantic liners had to shift gears and court a new clientele: tourists. The Olympic adapted quickly, and in late 1927, she was reconfigured to offer a new class, tourist third cabin, designed for passengers who wanted comfort without the hefty first-class price tag. New lounges and spaces were built just for them. Later, first class was overhauled again with additional bathrooms, a dance floor, and luxury suites that would rival any hotel on land. In November of 1929, just as she passed close to the very site where the Titanic had vanished, the Olympic began to shake violently. The vibrations lasted 2 whole minutes. But what was the cause? It wasn't an engine failure or a storm. It was the Grand Banks earthquake, shaking the Atlantic as she sailed over it. Then, as the Great Depression tightened its grip on the world, passenger numbers fell sharply. From over 1 million travelers annually across the Atlantic before the crash, the number had dropped by more than half by 1934. The Olympic, once filled with thousands, now often carried fewer than 500 passengers per trip. Still, she pressed on. By 1932, her old companion Homeric had been pulled from the route. Only Majestic and the Olympic remained. During summers, they were used for cruises between New York and Halifax, but the writing was on the wall. In early 1933, the Olympic received her final major refit. Her interior was refreshed. The famous grand staircase was painted in avocado green. Her hull got a new paint job to resemble her fleetmates. Her engines were still powerful, pushing her over 23 knots in tests. But all that shine couldn't stop the inevitable. That same year, for the first time, she operated at a loss. She carried fewer than 10,000 passengers, and 1934 brought the final blow. The retirement. In May, as she neared New York, the Olympic, now under Captain John Binks, was navigating thick fog and honing in on the radio signal of the Nantucket lightship. But she miscalculated. The fog swallowed visibility, and the Olympic didn't turn in time. She slammed into the lightship, slicing it in two. 11 men had been aboard, and only 4 survived. It was one of the worst collisions of her career, and her last. That same year, White Star Line merged with Cunard. The move was meant to keep both companies afloat during tough times and fund 2 new giants, Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. With those ships soon to enter service, the old queens had to go. On April 5, 1935, the Olympic left New York for the final time. Her days as a transatlantic marvel were over. She returned to Southampton, sat quietly for months beside her old rival Mauretania, and waited. Several offers came in, one to turn her into a hotel off the French coast, but none panned out. Eventually, she was sold to Member of Parliament Sir John Jarvis for just under £100,000. The plan was to dismantle her in Jarrow to create jobs for the struggling local economy. On October 13th, the Olympic arrived at the yard, and piece by piece, the Grand Lady was stripped down. Her fixtures were sold off, her hull was cut, and her engines, still roaring and ready, were silenced. The final remnants were hauled to Inverkeithing for total demolition by 1939. When her name was finally removed from the shipping registry that February, it was the end of a legend. But what happened to the third sister? The Britannic's fate. She was supposed to be the most prepared, the safest, the most advanced of her class. The Britannic was built bigger than her doomed sibling, the Titanic. And after the Titanic's catastrophic end, the Britannic's design was changed mid-construction, with new safety features, extra lifeboats, and higher bulkheads. The world called her unsinkable, but fate had other plans. With the Great War raging across continents, the Britannic was never allowed to live the luxurious life she was built for. Instead, she sailed not in peacetime grandeur, but as a hospital ship, painted in stark white with a green stripe and red crosses. She ferried the wounded between the Middle East and Britain, completing 5 successful missions. But it was her 6th journey, departing Southampton in November of 1916, that would change everything. By November 21st, she was pushing through the blue waters of the Aegean Sea at full speed, bound for Lemnos. On board were over 1,000 people, including crew members, doctors, nurses, and medical corps personnel. The sea was calm, and the storm that had chased them from Naples was behind them. Ahead, they believed, was just another routine voyage. Then, at 8:12 in the morning, the sea exploded beneath her. A mine, hidden below the surface in the Key Channel, planted by a German U-boat nearly a month earlier, detonated under her starboard side. The blast tore through the hull between cargo holds 2 and 3. Steel bent like paper, compartments flooded in seconds, and the watertight doors slammed shut, but not all of them worked. A fatal flaw was unfolding. The blast had done more than punch a hole in the ship. It had snapped the radio antenna cables between the masts, silencing any replies from nearby ships. The Britannic could scream into the void, but she couldn't hear anything back. She sent out distress calls, unaware they were landing in silence, and the water kept coming. She was built to survive 6 flooded compartments, but now a new vulnerability sealed her fate. Down in the lower decks, nurses had opened portholes to ventilate the wards. As the ship tilted, those open portholes dipped beneath the waterline. The sea poured in, it surged past the safety limit, and suddenly, just like the Titanic, the Britannic was on the clock. Captain Charles Bartlett, a seasoned sailor, fought to save her. He ordered a hard turn toward the island of Kea, hoping to beach her before she sank. But the steering was failing, and the propellers were still spinning, which were massive and dangerous. As lifeboats were lowered, 2 on the port side were sucked straight into the turning blades, and they shattered instantly. 30 people died in seconds because of the very engines meant to carry them home. Bartlett stopped the engines just in time to prevent more deaths, and by 8:50, over 1,000 had escaped into 35 lifeboats. There was hope until the flooding reached D-deck. Bartlett made one last desperate move. He restarted the engines, praying to push her onto land. But the moment she gained speed, the flooding accelerated, and it was over. At 9 in the morning, water touched the bridge. Bartlett gave the final order to abandon ship, and with 2 haunting blasts from the whistle, he and his officers dove into the sea. The ship groaned and twisted, funnels collapsed one by one, and the stern lifted skyward. Then, at exactly 9:07, just 55 minutes after the explosion, the Britannic disappeared beneath the Aegean. Her length was greater than the depth of the water, so when the bow slammed into the seabed, it crumpled. The Britannic became the largest ship lost in the entire First World War, but this time the rescue came fast. The water was warmer than it had been during the Titanic's tragedy. There were more lifeboats, and help was closer. Fishermen from Kea arrived first, pulling dozens from the water. By 10 o'clock, HMS Scourge spotted the first lifeboats. Minutes later, hundreds were hauled aboard by both Scourge and HMS Heroic. Many survivors also made it ashore at Corycia, where makeshift medical efforts began, on a dock, with scraps and lifebelts used as bandages. By the end, out of 1,066 people aboard, 1,036 survived. Only 30 perished. Compared to the Titanic's horror, it was a miracle, but her story, like her sister's, was marked not by how she lived, but by how she was lost. What the Britannic's sinking means. Here's something to think about. What if the mighty Titanic and her sister ship, the Britannic, were doomed before they ever touched water? Some say their fates were sealed by a quiet flaw hidden deep in their bones. Naval engineer Roger Long once raised eyebrows with a chilling theory. Both ships had expansion joints that were supposed to help the vessel bend and flex with the waves. but they were flawed. So when Titanic split apart mid-sink, was it really the iceberg that broke her, or her own brittle frame? And when Britannic sank in less than 1 hour after hitting a mine, despite having safety upgrades, did it feel all too familiar? Then comes the shadow of sabotage. The Britannic, repurposed as a hospital ship in World War I, should have been untouchable. Huge red crosses marked her hull. Yet in the Aegean Sea, she went down like a warship under attack. Some whisper she wasn't just ferrying the wounded, she was smuggling munitions. Others think she was silenced to bury darker secrets. No wreck lies quietly when there's this much smoke. And it seems like the Britannic had a secret so massive that it had to be sunk. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.